So today we're going to look over two movies that unfortunately came out in the same year and almost around the same time that have very similar setups, are set in totally different worlds, but pretty much have the exact same setup. I think The Raid had like some festival plays or maybe some international releases in 2011, but for the most part it's considered a 2012 release, which would have been the same time the Dredd was coming out, but that's still close enough to where I don't think there's really any way one could have possibly lifted from the other, so it was just one of those unfortunate things that's gonna constantly get you compared to another movie that you initially had nothing to do with prior to production or even in production. So these two have pretty much been lumped together ever since then, despite the fact that one of them is slowly turning into what, I don't know if it could still be potentially a trilogy or not. I hadn't really heard any word on that for a while, though I do believe the remake is dead, as far as I know. I really don't remember anymore. And a movie that actually already had a, well, its world already had a movie version of it. So, actually, even though The Raid did come out first, I think we're going to start with Dredd, actually, because I've talked about The Raid so much already, and I haven't even technically reviewed it, so... to start with Dredd, the really interesting thing is, if you want to compare it to something else besides The Raid, there's this idea that when it came out in 2012, I think it was September, comic book movies had pretty much reached a peak that we have never seen before, because it was in the early summer, the Avengers had just come out, which was like the pinnacle in this Marvel universe that had been building up, which obviously is still going. And then 2 months after that, we had The Dark Knight Rises, which was the end of Nolan's big Batman trilogy that really just kind of blew up in this enormous way when The Dark Knight came out. And people only really saw, comic movies were more in the mainstream than they had ever been at this time, and they established two different worlds, where people saw the Marvel world as the characters can be funny, and it can be kind of light, but also does not take away from how thrilling it is. And then there's The Dark Knight Rises, which people considered at the time to be kind of Nolan's trilogy being the darkened version of comic book heroes. And that was just kind of it for that time period. And then about 2 months, I think almost to the day that The Dark Knight Rises came out, we got a comic book movie that completely went against both of those and took us into a totally different world, and probably made the people feel a little silly that said Nolan's trilogy is what shows us the dark side of comic book movies. Regardless of stuff that had come out prior, like, you know, The Punisher or Blade or whatever, but in this established world, when it really, really exploded, this just kind of hit theaters, and it didn't do very well. I don't know if it has to do with the marketing or the property or what it was, or if people simply saw that it wasn't the Avengers or it wasn't a Batman movie with Nolan's name on it. Regardless, it was just kind of there. Or maybe it was the initial reaction to Stallone's movie. I don't know that either. But I will say, even though this is obviously, number one, a massive step up, and also it seems to totally be a completely different outlook on that property, it is very interesting to me how they were able to kind of build the world to the point that it was... I'm not really familiar with the books, so I can't really judge it based on that, but it's interesting to me that they took such a different approach, but at the same time, you can pretty much tell it's the same world as Stallone's movie, believe it or not. Regardless of how much more modern effects we can put into it, but just kind of the landscapes and the buildings and all that. And, you know, just the production design in general really kind of goes down to that. But obviously we're on a whole different level here, because I know a lot of people see Stallone's movie as kind of a guilty pleasure thing. There's probably some people out there that legitimately like it, and I'm not here to make fun of them. I'm really not. But I will just say, obviously this is brought to us by who has gone on to become a very acclaimed writer with Alex Garland, who had started with, as far as stuff that everybody recognizes, there was 28 Days Later, and then there was Danny Boyle's Sunshine, and then eventually, a few years after this, he'd go on to write and direct Ex Machina. And so this is brought to us by him, and we can really see how much he kind of went into this world before a director was even put on this. I would imagine a lot of that came with establishing what this world was going to be like and how it was going to kind of differ from the version we saw of it before. Because even though Stallone's movie was an R-rated movie, we didn't even remotely get a glimpse of the kind of stuff that we see in this. It's worth noting real quick that you go in and you expect this kind of, at the time, it's a regular thing now, but at the time you go in and you expect an update of this cheesy Sylvester Stallone movie. You don't really expect the brutal, gritty bloodbath that you get out of this movie. And that actually kind of starts with, obviously, you know, Dredd is our hero here, and we have Olivia Thirlby, who's also the rookie by his side. But to really kind of get a glimpse into this world, you kind of need to start with the villain. Which there are many of in this world, but I'm strictly talking about Lena Headey, Mama, as she is called. And we get this introduction to her. We get an introduction to her in a number of ways. It almost reminds me of the Hugo Stiglitz entrance in Inglourious Basterds, only maybe possibly even more extreme. Where we learn all this stuff, we learn that she feminized a guy with her teeth. There's the moment we see her gouging out Domhnall Gleeson's eyes, which plays a part through the rest of the movie. But most importantly, and I remember nobody else was in there, obviously a bit of a shame, but it's still good because I didn't embarrass myself, because I had a very vocal reaction in the theater to this first big instance of the evil she is capable of. Because we are introduced to this slow-mo drug that it's making the rounds throughout this part of the city that slows things down to like 1% of their normal speed to the person taking it. And so Mama says, well, we're going to kill these guys, but we're not just going to kill these guys. We're going to skin them alive and throw them down a 200-story building while they're on the slow-mo drug. And that might possibly be one of the most wicked, despicable acts a villain has ever committed in movie history. It would have to be close. I know it's a relatively recent movie to say in movie history, too, but I mean, it seriously does not get more evil than that. I really don't think so. And it was just... Oh, but anyway... That is the setup. That is the setup to our villain. And I do like that she's also... She could be, much like, say, the villain in The Raid, for instance, she could be one of those villains where hardcore is, he is. She could have just stayed at the top of the building and just kind of let everybody do the work and kind of been like, you know, the video game main boss level or whatever. This actually plays up less like a comic book movie and more like we actually got a good adaptation of a video game. To the point, like, if I wasn't aware of the property whatsoever, and I just watched this totally and completely blind of everything, I would probably assume this movie was based on a video game. But she's not the type that just stands at the very top and waits for everything to come to her. We actually get the moments where she comes down, and she uses the cannons and all that. And it really does add to where it doesn't take away when we add villains that get to do more as far as interacting with our heroes, like, say, Kay, Wood Harris's character. And so yeah, that's a really good starting point for this. Like, a movie like this, when you're just gonna kind of be non-stop action, you have to have that villain that you're waiting to get to at the top, and you really couldn't have asked for a better one here, to really just set things off. Though we do say this, and though the setup is nice and definitely a good kind of way to go in another direction from the one version of it that moviegoers would already be familiar with, there's still some stuff in here, like there's still some cliches, like there is the whole dystopian future thing has long since been a cliche now. It just depends on how you do it, whether it's worth it or not. And then there's, you know, a lot of the dialogue, like, if he, I know that's what she is, but I mean, for God's sake, I was gonna go Donald Gleason, I was gonna gouge my own eyes out the next time he called her rookie, but I guess that's the standard, you know, almost kind of taking it to the old-fashioned cop stories or whatever, despite being in this kind of futuristic world. I guess that's what that's there for. We'll say that's what it's there for, so to give it a break. And that's the thing, too, is a lot of this doesn't matter too much because the director is able to give it such a flair that something like, say, Judge Dredd didn't have. Something that really kind of makes it stand out, not just from, say, another movie like it, but also in the world of not just comic book movies either, but action movies, where this movie really has a visual style to where you can just instantly identify it, which is something a lot of action movies are definitely missing. So, and a lot of that comes into play with the slow-mo sequences, where it's almost like just every shot here just seems like it could be like this standalone image that's just completely like pops out of the screen and into your damn face. I'm gonna be totally honest, I did see this in theaters. To be totally honest, I cannot remember if I saw it in 3D or not. Because 3D doesn't typically make a big difference to me. But I will say that it is a movie that I don't think, because there are a lot of movies that utilize it. Like, it was actually released in theaters called Dredd 3D, in most theaters, especially the bigger ones. And this is definitely a movie to where I totally get how it was made for it. Like, if it was made for it like this was, then you can absolutely go for that. And I do like that if you just kind of hear about the movie and you maybe you see some of it here and there, you may think there's a bit of a darkness to it that might kind of not be very visually appealing, but for the most part, there are a lot of things that really just kind of make it stand out on a visual scale, and it's not bogged down. It's not one of those movies where you basically have to squint to see all the action in the dark. Even though there are a lot of dark hallways and dark locations, you can pretty much know exactly what. The only time I would say this is a problem would be when it's kind of a cool idea, but I do think it makes the movie become a clusterfuck towards the end, and that is when the corrupt judges start coming in, and literally everybody, even male and female, look exactly the same, and the only way you can really tell who's who is if you're lucky enough to get a glimpse of their name badge. That kind of makes things confusing and makes you really unsure of who's who. That may be the point, but I don't think it is. So, so that kind of becomes a problem, but for the most part, the action is very well done, especially for just being, it's not, you know, these fantastic fight sequences like you would see in the Raid. It's really just people being shot. There's really not a whole lot of physical fighting that I remember, but it still manages to make it work despite that. And now talking about the other characters, about our hero, Dredd, I will say, I really hope you don't hate me for this, but I would just like to say that Karl Urban does a good job as Dredd here. And obviously they do the whole thing where he never takes his helmet off, which I believe is comes back to the comics. Like, to the point that people were upset that throughout most of Judge Dredd we just saw Stallone's face all the time. But here we never see Karl Urban's face except for about right here. This is all we get, and he basically gets to do mouth acting. It's kind of like the reverse Tom Hardy in The Dark Knight Rises, where all he had to work with was his eyes. Here, Karl Urban only has down here. And he does make that work. I have heard a lot of praise. I have heard infinite praise about what Karl Urban is able to bring to this role, just using his mouth and his voice. It is very good. I don't think he did anything particularly above and beyond that pretty much any relatively capable actor could have pulled off. I mean, he does bring more to it than just, you know, he does have a way of doing it and making the character really authoritative and really making him that character that you know all criminals fear. But with what the script gives him, which is a lot of not so great dialogue, which of course is that he's supposed to he's basically human RoboCop. So it's pretty much, his lines are going to be limited, and a lot of them are kind of those cool one-liner things, like "hot shot." Uh, it doesn't. They don't always work for me, but I get it. How they kind of bring a little bit of that cheesiness into a very dark world, because one of the great things that this movie does is it does the really violent, really bleak, and really gritty thing, but it does something that a lot of movies that do that fail at, and it actually does it well, and that is, despite being dark, bleak, and gritty like this, and just going all out on this horrific violence and all that, it's still never taken itself, like, super, super seriously. That could have been where it really failed, and I think that's definitely what makes it a step above the movies that are generally like it, is it still kind of has this fun way about it while also being able to embrace that gritty side to it. And some stuff that is, you know, even darkly, like doing both at the same time, like the vagrant that's there by the door when they're walking in the building, and he says, you know, "You're loitering, don't be here when we get back." And the guy basically says, "Fuck you, I'm staying here," and he graphically, horrifically pays for it. And there's actually something, as gruesome as it is, there's something kind of very darkly humorous about the fact that if he had just listened to Dredd's tiny little plea, the dude would not have been completely and totally crushed to death. There is something funny and a bit ironic about that. But there's also time for character work also, where really the best person we have here as far as character development is obviously Olivia Thirlby's character, which has a lot of interesting things going on here because it kind of introduces one thing here, whereas obviously there's cases like when they're in the elevator, another dry comedic moment, when she can read minds, so she knows that he's about to make a move for Dredd's gun, and then she says, "Oh, well, he just changed his mind. Go figure," after I said it. But that also brings in a lot of stuff that they explore, starting with, it's very interesting to see her able to kind of see all the different sides of the criminals, even if she's about to execute one. Like, obviously she gets that moment where she's the rookie, and it'll be the first time she has to kill somebody, so she has that moment of pause. But the thing about it is, because she can read minds, it's like she has more of an understanding about all these people that they're killing. Like, we just see, you know, the faceless criminals that just have to go down, the faceless henchmen and all that. But her character can see, like, all the way where they came from and how they got up to this point. And the fact that we have a character in here that can understand the so-called faceless people that are being offed is a really interesting take to put in there. I feel like they could have explored it maybe a little more than they do, but that they were able to get it in enough in the span of like the 95 minutes this movie takes place is pretty impressive. And then there's also the ways they use that where Kay realizes that he can use it against her, and he can, like, have images of her in his head in bad situations to kind of throw her off her game a little bit, and how they kind of have to literally have a battle of wits over that. I think it's a really clever way to take. So there's all that stuff, but the one thing also, going back to the it doesn't take itself too seriously thing, is this, usually movies tend to do this and have kind of these ways about them that they don't necessarily, there's always this need, I know it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I'm kind of building it up to be here. But the thing here is that we have a lot of movies, there's a particular director who I will not name that I'm looking at specifically when I say this, but what happens here is there will be people that make really, really violent movies, and movies set in these really violent worlds, and then after they have fun with all the gore and all the play and all that, they want to backpedal and say it's a commentary on society, or it's a commentary on violence. This movie is not commentating on a damn thing. This movie is just a story of these futuristic cops who have one job. There is really nothing. The great thing about here is that we don't have to go into a whole lot. Olivia Thirlby gives us just enough character work for us to care about everybody. Dredd is a person that exists with 3 jobs and only 3 jobs, and that is judge, jury, and executioner, and that is all we need to know, and that's all they give us. And there's even that time where they kind of tease, like they're gonna give us something that's lurking behind the helmet, and then they just nip it in the bud real quick. And they say, no, you don't need to know any more than that. All you need to know is that this guy is here to do his job, and then he's going to leave. We don't even know what kind of home he's going to go back to. We just know he's here to do his job, and then that'll be it. Once he gets out of this building, the movie will end, and that's all that matters. Because that's the only portion of this story that we need to have. It's not trying to say, you know, oh, this is what our society could become, and it's not to say, oh, you know, violence is bad or whatever. It just uses these elements, it tells its story, and it goes the fuck home. And that's all it needs to do. And it knows very well that, because it knows very well that it went through all the trouble to set up this world that it lives in. And it's good enough to know that this is, in fact, a fictional world that it built. This isn't necessarily some mirror to the outside world or whatever, or to our particular world. It sets up its own fictional world and lives inside it and doesn't feel the need to come out. And that's what I think makes it so good and makes it stand above other movies that try to do this kind of same thing, but try to be more than really, they bite off more than they can chew. Like, it's good if you want to try to be more, if you can pull that off, but you gotta know you can pull it off before you even start. In some movies, don't take that precaution. They just dive into it and think they're saying something profound, when they could just be making a movie where all it is dudes getting shot in the face, and you could still make something totally quality out of it. And that is what this movie did. And it takes those kind of B-movie qualities, like I said, the cheesy dialogue and the one-liners, and it's just people dying and action scenes galore. But it embraces it in a way, and it embraces that B-movie thing in a way. But the thing is, it is able to do it and make something worthwhile. You could say Stallone's movie embraced its cheesiness. But that could have even made it dumber. That could have been its downfall. You just really, really have to know how to do it. And Alex Garland and Pete Travis and Carl Urban and everybody else involved here knew what they were doing, and that's why we got a movie like Dredd. So I think that's what's the most important thing to take away from this. And I do think, as much as I praise it, I do think it doesn't quite do enough to sustain its runtime. It probably could have been about 10 minutes shorter, because it does kind of get to a point where we get a little rundown before we get that final showdown with Mama. But for the most part, it does hold up, and it's 95 minutes is still a good, you know, a good goal. But I do think they probably could have cut a little down, or if they didn't want to cut it down, could have maybe thrown at least one more thing into the mix to mix it up just a little more. But for the most part, it does everything that it does do exactly as it should, without having to be something that goes bigger or more philosophical or whatever the fuck. So, onto the Raid. There's really not a whole lot, I don't think, I can say about the Raid that I haven't already, especially after my perfect score review of its sequel back in 2014. But I will say here that this is another movie, much like Dredd, where you really don't need a whole lot to go in it. What's really good about what the Raid does is, when it first came out, it pretty much had an instant status. Like, as soon as people laid eyes on it, it pretty much became an action movie classic, and just the praise was just coming non-stop. And there was always that question of, is it warranted? Is it going to hold up to the hype? And this is one of those movies that just, you really have to see it. And it's, I mean, I guess anything is, you know, vulnerable to not hold up to its own hype. But I mean, I believe this is one of those rare cases where it's really hard to not, you know, get where all that's coming from. And we start off with this very small scene at the very start. There is hardly any build-up to this movie, but the beautiful thing is that it's just enough, because we know that Rama's going to go into this building with like 19 other cops, and they're going to raid everything, as the title tells us. A lot of people will probably die, there will be a lot of fights, and there is a crime lord at the top. And we need to get up there, once again, almost like a video game, and then solve this problem that may or may not continue into another movie. But The thing here is that you say, well, there is, like, no room for characters here. There's, like, what do we got here? We got the blonde lieutenant, we've got the other guy, the other superior, and then just all the other guys. And then it's like, well, how are we supposed to relate to this? How are we supposed to know, you know, like, when this guy dies, why is it sad? Or when this guy's in trouble, why should we be worried? But here's the thing, is Rama is our main character, and there are two things that we know immediately about him in the span of this 2-minute opening scene with hardly any dialogue. It is that he has a pregnant wife, and he goes up to his father and he says, I'm going to bring him back, who obviously he's referring to his brother. So in the first 1.5 to 2 minutes, we learn what he has to lose and what his main objective is. That's it. That's all we need. Now we can just fuck people up and just break bones and just fight and shoot each other and do all that stuff, and we have a good enough foundation because this movie pulled it off well enough. Please be aware that it is all about the execution. There is, in fact, a way to make an action movie that is absolute pure action, and the only thing you need is like 2 minutes of establishment. That is all you need. That is 120 seconds of what you need to establish, of what's going on here, and then, if you're good enough, you can just go crazy for the next 1.5 or 1:40 even. Or if you're the second movie, 2.5 hours. But I've already talked about all of that amazingness. So here's the thing here, is we do kind of start off when we're getting the kind of rundown on the way to the raid, when we're in the back of the van. And this is when you kind of notice the dialogue probably isn't all that strong. It is very straightforward dialogue, and it can be quite clunky and maybe sometimes even laughable. But then again, when you're dealing with a foreign language being translated through subtitles, there's a very good chance something's being lost in translation. So, in this case, much like most good action movies, the dialogue probably isn't too important. It's definitely a plus if you have an amazing action movie that also just happens to have really good dialogue, but in a movie like this, where it's not front and center, and it's only really here to establish a few things you need to know in order to know why all the shit you're watching is going down, then it's not too much of a necessity, as long as you get the point across without totally and completely embarrassing yourself, which it's not that bad by any means. So we're introduced to a villain, and the interesting thing here, as I was saying about Mama and Kay, is that Kay is a really good villain by himself. I really like that he's kind of like, he doesn't really see himself as above or below the judges. He kind of sees himself kind of on the same wavelength, and that's what makes him a really interesting character, in the way he's able to kind of mess with people's heads and know where people's vulnerable spots are. But still, Mama is obviously, by all means, the ultimate villain. And in here, it's kind of a reverse now, where it's like, we have our main villain here, but like I was saying before, he's pretty much the villain. He does establish himself quickly as a huge threat, because we have the execution scene that's very strong when he shoots the dude, he shoots another dude, and he runs out of bullets. In that moment when he just lays the gun on the dude's shoulder while the dude is still awaiting death, and he doesn't quite know how it's going to come, and then, I believe it's a hammer, happens to him, and we set up that this is a super, super bad dude. However, this dude is by no means the guy I would call the main villain of the movie. And I think a lot of people would probably agree with that. I'm not talking about Blonde Lieutenant either. No, I am of course talking about Mad Dog. And Mad Dog is this dude where I don't even think that's technically his name. I think it's just from the intro when the guy says, watch out for that dude, he's a mad dog. And then like the script just called him Mad Dog the rest of the time because that's the only introduction we had to him. So, watching this dude, how he's already kind of threatening in appearance, but he's not very big, but you just get a sense of him, just in kind of the way he stands there with his arms folded. You kind of know, like, okay, maybe we don't mess with him. But then he starts fighting, and it's like the dude is weightless. And it's like he can do pretty much any damn thing with his body. It's worth noting, I believe, the guy that played Rama, the guy that plays Mad Dog, and Gareth Evans, the writer, editor, and director, did the choreography for the fight scenes. So it's all very... I love that it's always nice when we can get really involved in that, and the actors can kind of combine with the work they're doing, because it's not like when you see them fighting, not just each other but other people, it's sort of like you get this idea of they weren't actors that were taught this. This was the shit they were already doing, and it really kind of adds this. It kind of gives you like you feel like you're in good hands when a fight scene starts, because you're like, these are guys that clearly know what they're doing with this, and it kind of takes this. I don't want to sound a bit stupid when I say this or pretentious or whatever, but this is one of those movies where when you're watching the fight scenes and the way they're put together so meticulously, you start to realize why the word arts is in martial arts. When you see, like, the dedication and precision, because you just watch the movie, and it's like, dudes, it's like a very, very violent ballet. It's like, they know every kick that's coming, they know every wall somebody's gonna hit into, or a table somebody's gonna go through, or how anybody is about to get struck in a violent way, whether it be with a weapon or with somebody's body part. And it is so well thought out, because you're watching this and it just looks like people are just having these, you know, improvised throwdowns, and you don't know where the next hit or the kick is going to come from, or what weapon is going to be used from out of nowhere, but it's all so incredibly meticulously thought out and rehearsed over and over again, and just how perfectly one flows right into the other is all so incredibly choreographed. And I love also that there are those moments where there doesn't even really seem to be much of a break. Like there's the moment when Rama is briefly outside the building because he goes through the window and they fall down where the fire escape is. And then after that dude's taken out, what does Rama do? He breaks a window and goes back into the building. And then there is that really good shot too, where it's when they're fighting and there's a hole in the floor, and I love when he falls down and we just see all the dudes through the hole just come at him at once, and then the camera goes through that hole and just keeps going unbroken. And that's what I love. This is a movie that the reason, I don't know if how much of this you've watched, but I'm sure it's not just me, I'm sure it's every person who's ever reviewed a recent action movie ever. Pretty much any time you look at an action movie now, even in like this John Wick phase we're going through, your mind always goes back to, well, how does it compare to what The Raid did? Because The Raid, it came out in 2012, and then kind of set this brand new gold standard of what action movies should look like. Not to say that everything should like look like it, or look like exact, you know, replicas of it, but just the way Evans went about the direction and the editing as well. Because obviously, as I'm sure it's been talked about to death at this point, because we've had a lot of really bad action movies lately. I know that's common, but I mean, now in post-The Raid world, bad action movies look so much worse than they probably would have pre-Raid. So, but now we see that the idea is, you back the camera away from your actors a little bit, you get the full battle in here, you don't need to see, well, this is what this person's doing there in this fight, and then this is what this person's doing with this fight. You get the full view, you don't get very many edits, you don't have to have an edit every time somebody gets hit, Paul W.S. Anderson, you do not need to do that. And then the way they're able to just kind of, like I say, go from one place even to the other. And then there is this fight with Mad Dog, this amazing, incredible climax. I mean, you could say the stairwell is the climax. I mean, let's say the real climax of this movie is the fight with Rama, his brother, and Mad Dog. And it really kind of sets up that cliche that everybody likes to call out, where you'll notice if there's like one bad guy and one good guy and four bad guys, they all attack him one at a time. That's just what they do. And then, obviously, we have this moment where that could be the same way around. We could have one bad guy or two good guys, as we do here, and it could be, well, Rama goes after him, gets hit, his brother will give it a try, and then just back and forth. But they do this to where they both go at him at the same time, and the only way that he's fighting one at a time is when the other is trying to recover from a massive blow they've just taken. But for the most part, they come at him from both sides, and that's what makes this scene incredible, is we see with hardly any cuts, from a bit of a distance, just enough to see all three players involved here, how Mad Dog fights off two dudes at the same time, and these people are our heroes, so we know they're going to get the edge eventually, and the way he is able to fight them off is... Yes, that's the way pretty much... That's the way you kind of imagine what it should look like when we have these, a whole bunch of people against one fights, whether it be the single person as the hero or the villain. And then, obviously, just the way they use the surroundings, and they even, the stab into the neck, where the blood is even, like, pouring out of the hole at the end, and the dude is still going. And the thing is this doesn't even feel all that... Obviously, this movie does have over-the-top moments, like when Rama practically flies across the room and brings the guy's neck down on the broken door. But when we see stuff like that, and we see stuff like Mad Dog still fighting with the pipe in his neck, or the light in his neck, we have seen just so much extreme violence and extreme fighting up to this point that it all doesn't... There's nothing that really takes you out of it. There's nothing that makes you say, okay, well, this is cool and this is cool, but that's kind of overdoing it, or that thing goes a little bit too over the top. Everything feels like it fits because it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and more intense and more extreme and more violent and more everything as it goes. And, yes, and that's the thing, too, is I talked about the editing and a portion of the choreography, as well as the writing and directing, are all Gareth Evans. And the interesting thing is, you see this movie, you see the stamp it is made on the action genre, and you think, okay, what master did this? What veteran of the industry did this? And then you realize it's a dude that came from out of nowhere, and this is how he's establishing himself. And it really sets up, and that's the thing too, is I don't want to get too much into the sequel I already reviewed, but that I called the best movie of 2014. And it is just insane to me that this guy could do this and could establish himself and make this movie that is basically the layout for what every action movie that comes out now should aspire to be, in like technical form and all that other stuff, and really even like minimal storytelling even. And the dude was able to come out and make a sequel that was an hour longer and that was bigger, more bloody, more massive, in a bunch more locations, and just made an all-around masterpiece. I don't think the first Raid is a masterpiece. I do think it's very, very good, and like I said, very much a starting point for what movies like it should be from now on. But that he was able to go on that and make a sequel that's probably one of the best action movies ever made. Seriously. it is insane. And that's the thing, too, is this movie so made its mark that people were coming out of it saying this might actually be one of the best action movies ever made. And you hear something like that and your first thought immediately is like, that dude needs to see more movies, or, well, that dude must be new to the genre or something. And then you watch it and you're like, I don't know the last time I saw this genre done so well, or so perfectly. And really just raises the bar in a way for genres, that any genre, it's really hard to have seen a genre get so brought up from what it was, or where it had become, or where it seemed to kind of be stuck in a way that the Raid raised the action genre. It is just absolute pure insanity. And amongst all this really heavy, non-stop action, it does have moments to stop, and not necessarily just stop for a little dialogue here and there to establish where we are in the story now, but to throw in moments of suspense as well, like the moment when the guy's walking down the hallway and tapping his blade against the wall, and that's the only way we really know where he is the sound of that blade, and everybody's just kind of preparing to jump out and for a throwdown to happen with this dude. I really love the build-up with that, and there's little stuff like little stuff is our hero was being killed, and even having a wound that goes all the way through to the next movie, but it's, the moment when Rama's behind the wall, and the dude knows he's in there, and is just kind of stabbing through until he gets to him. These are moments where we don't necessarily have to have... It's still very, very intense, and obviously still life or death, and still, you know, things being stabbed, but it's not like just this constant barrage of people beating the shit out of each other or shooting the shit out of each other. But they're still able to make it non-stop with even those moments where they use suspense and not just the action and the violence. So that always adds to it also. And it's not even too... Oh, I'm sure I can probably get some disagreements here, but I will say that I don't think the violence in it is too excessive. Obviously, this is the unrated version that's probably only like 30 seconds of difference or something, just little shots that are slightly more explicit than they were in the R-rated version, but as far as I know, only going on this, I don't remember it being, like, there's a way they treat the violence here where it's... Obviously, the editing isn't too fast. That's one of the big, ups about this movie. But the thing is it's just enough to where the violence doesn't feel like it's kind of thriving on it, even though it is, like, non-stop violent. But when you're talking about the violence caused to each individual person, where pretty much as soon as somebody's dead, like the instant they reach the point of death, the camera has already gone to somebody else, and another fight is breaking out, and so on. We don't really linger on stuff too much, which I think really helps for making it not seem like it's kind of wallowing in its violence, which a lot of movies like this are probably accused of, and I can understand the argument, but I do think that it kind of cuts away enough to where it is very brutally, bloodily, graphically violent, but not in a way that's actually too excessive. And there are moments that kind of linger on it a bit, like Mad Dog's death, or like the moment when, this is a time I should probably bring up, the sound in this is really good too, and stabbings come to mind, like when the other superior repeatedly stabs the dude in the stomach, and they're like right here in front of the camera. Where that's probably types where it could seem excessive, where it doesn't take one stab, it takes like 20, and we see like all of them. But usually when it lingers like that, especially in the Mad Dog fight, it's mainly because of desperation from the character that's doing the killing, where it's like, this is a dude they've been fighting, this is a dude that's been really dangerous and could kill them. They want to make sure the dude's dead. Like, just one shot, or like just one stab usually does it, but this particular person has been a problem, we want to make sure they stay down, so we're going to get a little extreme and continuous with them just to make sure this fucker's not getting back up. So I understand it in that sense, but I do understand if people do think it may be excessively violent, but I think it kind of goes around that well enough to where it doesn't feel too in your face about it, and it does kind of go, like I said, from one thing to the other pretty smoothly without kind of feeling like it's lingering on how brutal it is, or taking pleasure in it or anything. So, yes, so as I said, it's a movie that just reached legendary status instantly, and like I said, set up a sequel that is one of the best movies of the decade, if not the past 2 decades. And so yes, like this, now that the sequel exists, this one almost seems very minor, and it's still so insane to me how a movie like this, that is so incredibly extreme and so off the wall and so incredibly done, has a movie after it that is so good that it can seem minor. It's insane, but like I said, it's hard to kind of get off the sequel to just talk about this one. That's how much it makes an impact. But yes, this one was the starting point, and this one was where it all came from. And like I said, this is what the genre should be striving to be, and I think most people know that by now. Like in this world of really well-edited and well-choreographed action movies like John Wick now have come after it. And I can only think that, at least for a while, we'll have the Raid to thank for a lot of the quality action movies that we'll be getting down the road in the next few years. So, and everything, obviously, between 2012 and now. So yeah, clearly, I do prefer the Raid over Dredd. Actually, kind of by a large margin, but obviously, from everything I said, Dredd is still great. But the Raid, even though it's not as good, near as good as its sequel, and still has a very good quality, there's no denying that it really set the bar for where things are, and where things could be going and should be going, so there we go. So tomorrow we'll be talking about The Mummy. I guess we'll see what happens. And then the week after that, I will be seeing It Comes at Night. So there is that. And I do already know what the next one for this is as well. It's it's 2 movies that share a director and actor teaming up. So that are pretty well beloved and well respected movies. So that should be fun. So, and one of which is one of my personal favorites. So yeah, until then, yeah, I think we're done here.